The day I inherited $8 million from my father, I made a decision that would save my life. I told my husband absolutely nothing. I sat in that lawyer's office, signing document after document, while James waited in the car outside, scrolling through his phone, completely oblivious to the fact that his wife had just become a multimillionaire. He thought we were there to collect a small inheritance, maybe $50,000 if we were lucky. He had no idea that in that moment, I was building a fortress around assets he would never touch. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here, because this story doesn't start with an inheritance. It starts 3 days earlier at my father's funeral. My father, Marcus Chen, died of a heart attack at 62 years old. He was a self-made real estate mogul who had built an empire from nothing. A man who came to this country with $200 in his pocket and turned it into millions through sheer determination and smart investments. He was my hero, my mentor, and the one person in my life who always told me the truth, even when I didn't want to hear it, especially when I didn't want to hear it. And the truth he told me most often, the one I refused to believe for 5 years, was that my husband didn't love me. He loved what he thought I would inherit. The funeral was on a gray Tuesday morning in October. The church was packed with people whose lives my father had touched, business associates, former employees, families he had helped when they couldn't make rent, children whose college educations he had quietly funded. My father was generous in ways most people never knew about. He believed wealth was a responsibility, not just a privilege. James stood beside me during the service, his hand on my shoulder, playing the role of the supportive husband perfectly. He wore the expensive black suit I didn't know he had bought, shook hands with mourners, and said all the right things. Marcus was a great man. We'll miss him terribly. He meant so much to our family. But I noticed something that day, something that should have been insignificant but wasn't. James kept checking his phone. During the eulogy, during the prayers, during the burial. His face was illuminated by that blue screen every few minutes, and each time he looked at it, I saw something flicker across his features. Not grief, not sadness, something else entirely. Anticipation. At the reception after the funeral, James asked me a question that sent ice through my veins. We were standing by the buffet table, surrounded by people eating finger sandwiches and speaking in hushed, respectful tones, and he leaned close to my ear and whispered, "Did your dad leave a will? Not, how are you holding up? Not, what can I do to support you? But, did your dad leave a will?" I remember staring at him, searching his face for some indication that he realized how inappropriate that question was, how cold and calculating it sounded just hours after we had buried my father. But there was nothing, just curiosity and something that looked uncomfortably like excitement. I told him I didn't know, which was a lie. I knew exactly what was in my father's will because he had told me 3 months before he died, during one of our weekly dinners. But James's question confirmed something I had been suspecting for months. My husband wasn't mourning my father's death. He was celebrating it. The real confirmation came 30 minutes later. I had gone to the bathroom, and when I returned, I saw James standing outside on the church steps, phone pressed to his ear, turned away from the crowd. I moved closer, staying in the shadow of the doorway, and I heard him say, "Yeah, the old man finally kicked it. Should be good for us. Should be good for us." My father wasn't even cold in the ground, and my husband was talking about his death like it was a business opportunity. I stood there, frozen, listening to James laugh at something the person on the other end said. Then he added, "I'll keep you posted on the will situation. If it's what we think, we're golden." He hung up and turned around, and our eyes met. For a split second, I saw something cross his face, a flash of guilt or maybe concern that I had overheard. But then he smiled, that same warm smile that had made me fall in love with him 6 years ago, and said, "You okay, babe? You look pale." That's when I knew. My husband wasn't just opportunistic. He was dangerous. And whatever plan he had been formulating, whatever scheme he had been discussing on that phone call, I needed to understand it completely before he had a chance to execute it. So I did something I had never done in 5 years of marriage. I lied. I smiled back at James and said, "I'm fine, just tired." And then I started watching him. really watching him. Because if my father had taught me anything, it was this. When someone shows you who they really are, believe them. Let me tell you about my marriage, because you need to understand how I ended up here, married to a man who saw me as a paycheck rather than a partner. James and I met 6 years ago at a mutual friend's birthday party. He was charming, funny, attentive in ways that made me feel special. He worked in sales, or so he said, and he had this confidence about him that I found attractive. He pursued me relentlessly, flowers at my workplace, surprise dinners, weekend getaways. Within 6 months, we were engaged. Within a year, we were married. And I was so in love, so convinced I had found my person, that I ignored every single red flag my father tried to point out. The first red flag was James's obsession with my father's money. He never asked about Marcus as a person, about his hobbies or his health or his happiness. He asked about his business, his properties, his investment portfolio. "Your dad must be worth millions," James would say casually, like he was commenting on the weather. "Do you think he'll help us buy a house?" I always deflected these questions because they made me uncomfortable, but James was persistent. The second red flag was his spending habits. James claimed he made $80,000 a year in sales commissions, but somehow we were always broke. He bought expensive clothes, went out for costly dinners with clients, and once spent $3,000 on a watch that he said was necessary for his image. When I questioned the spending, he became defensive. "I'm building a career," he would say. "You have to spend money to make money." But we weren't making money. We were drowning in debt. The third red flag, the one I should have paid attention to but didn't, was his relationship with my father. James tried so hard to impress Marcus, laughing too loud at his jokes, complimenting his business acumen, asking questions about real estate investing. But my father saw through it immediately. After our first family dinner, Marcus pulled me aside and said, "That man doesn't love you. He loves what he thinks you're going to inherit." I was furious. How dare my father judge my husband? How dare he assume the worst about someone I loved? We didn't speak for 3 months after that conversation, and James was thrilled. "Your dad is so controlling," he would say. "You're better off without him interfering in our lives." But eventually, Marcus and I reconciled because he was my father, and I missed him. James wasn't happy about it, but he pretended to be supportive. "I'm glad you're talking to your dad again," he said. But what he really meant was, "I'm glad you're back in the will." By year 3 of our marriage, I started noticing things I had been too blind to see before. Credit card statements showing $47,000 in debt that James had hidden from me. Receipts for expensive dinners at restaurants we had never been to together. And then, in year 4, I found the text messages. I wasn't snooping, at least not intentionally. James had asked me to check something on his phone, and when I opened it, there was a text thread with someone named Vanessa. The messages weren't romantic, which somehow made them worse. They were transactional, cold, calculating. Vanessa had written, "How much longer until the old man dies?" And James had responded, "Can't be much longer. He's 61 and has high blood pressure. When it happens, we split everything 50-50. Then I divorce her and we're free." I stared at those messages for a full minute, my hands shaking, my mind refusing to process what I was reading. My husband was planning my father's death. He was planning to take my inheritance. And then he was planning to leave me. I should have confronted him right then. I should have screamed, thrown his phone across the room, demanded answers. But I didn't, because I realized something important in that moment. If I confronted James, he would lie. He would gaslight me, tell me I was misunderstanding, that Vanessa was just a friend making a dark joke. He would manipulate me the way he had been manipulating me for 4 years. So instead, I took screenshots of every message. I sent them to myself and deleted the evidence that I had done so. And then I handed James back his phone and said, "Everything looks fine." He smiled at me, kissed my forehead, and went back to watching television, completely unaware that his wife had just discovered his betrayal. That night, I lay in bed next to a man I no longer knew, and I made a decision. I would document everything. I would wait, and when the time came, I would destroy him. Over the next year, I became an investigator in my own marriage. I tracked James's spending, his phone calls, his meetings. I discovered that Vanessa wasn't his mistress, at least not in the traditional sense. She was his partner in crime, an ex-girlfriend from college who had a history of targeting wealthy men. I found records of 2 previous relationships she had been involved in, both with men who had family money, both relationships that had ended in suspicious circumstances and financial settlements. Vanessa was a professional con artist, and James was her eager student. Together, they had been planning this scheme for 2 years, since before my father's health started declining. They had calculated how much I would inherit, how they would access it, and how they would disappear together once the money was in their hands. The only thing they hadn't calculated was me. When my father called me 3 months before his death and asked me to meet him for dinner, I knew something was wrong. Marcus looked tired, older than his 62 years, and there was something in his eyes that I had never seen before: fear. We sat in his favorite restaurant, the one where we had celebrated every birthday and milestone of my life, and he told me he had been diagnosed with a heart condition. The doctors said he had maybe 5 years, maybe less. He needed to get his affairs in order. "I'm leaving everything to you," he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. $8 million in assets. Cash, properties, investments. "But Maya, I need you to promise me something. Don't tell James. Not until you're absolutely sure of his character." I started to protest, to defend my husband out of habit, but Marcus stopped me. "I know you found the messages," he said quietly. I felt my face go hot. "How did you?" "I hired a private investigator 6 months ago," Marcus admitted. "I needed to know if my instincts about James were correct. They were. He's planning to take your inheritance and leave you. I have proof. My father showed me everything that night. Photos of James meeting with Vanessa at hotels, though apparently their relationship wasn't sexual yet, just strategic. Financial records showing that James wasn't making $80,000 a year. He was making $52,000 and lying about the rest. Bank statements proving he had been embezzling small amounts from his company to fund his lifestyle, about $30,000 over 2 years. And most damning of all, recorded phone conversations where James discussed the plan in detail. Once Marcus dies, Maya inherits everything. We wait 6 months, maybe a year, then I file for divorce. In our state, I get half of everything acquired during the marriage. We're talking $4 million each minimum. Vanessa's voice responded, "And what about Maya? Won't she fight it?" James laughed. "Maya? She's too trusting, too naive. She'll never see it coming. By the time she realizes what's happening, we'll be in Costa Rica living like kings." I listened to those recordings sitting in my father's study, tears streaming down my face. Not because I was surprised, but because hearing the man I had loved speak about me with such contempt was unbearable. Marcus put his arm around me and said, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. I wish I had been wrong." But he wasn't wrong. He had been right all along, and I had been too proud or too foolish to listen. That night, my father and I made a plan. He was going to structure his will in a way that protected me completely. All assets would be placed in irrevocable trusts with me as the sole beneficiary. Because the inheritance was from before our marriage and placed in separate trusts, James would have zero legal claim to any of it. But we needed to be smart about the reveal. "Don't tell him the truth," Marcus advised. "Let him think you're only inheriting a small amount. Watch how he reacts. See if there's any part of the man you married that's still decent. And if there isn't, if he shows you that he's exactly who I think he is, then you'll know what you need to do." My father died 3 months later, suddenly, despite the doctor's predictions that he had years left. The heart attack was massive and quick, and he was gone before the ambulance arrived. I was devastated, but even in my grief, I remembered his instructions. "Don't tell James about the money. Watch him. See who he really is." So that's exactly what I did. 3 days after the funeral, I met with my father's estate attorney, Robert Chun, no relation despite the shared last name. Robert was a sharp man in his 60s who had worked with my father for 20 years. He had been briefed on the entire situation, had copies of all the evidence my father had gathered, and he was ready to help me execute the plan. Your father was very clear about his wishes, Robert said, spreading documents across his desk. Everything is structured to protect you. The trusts are ironclad. James cannot touch any of this money, even if he tries to contest the will, which he won't be able to do because he's not a beneficiary. The assets were staggering. $3 million in liquid cash. $4 million in commercial and residential properties scattered across 3 states. $1 million in carefully diversified stock portfolios. My father had built an empire, and he had left all of it to me. But he had also left me something more valuable than money. He left me a letter. Robert handed it to me in a sealed envelope with my name written in my father's distinctive handwriting. I opened it with shaking hands and read, "My darling daughter, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm so sorry I can't be there to guide you through what comes next. I've left you everything I built because you are the only person I trust to use it wisely, to build on it, to create something meaningful. But I need you to be smart, Maya. James is not the man you think he is. This money is yours alone. It was earned before your marriage, so legally, it's separate property. But I know he'll try to take it anyway. He'll manipulate you, guilt you, maybe even threaten you. Don't let him. Protect yourself the way I always tried to protect you. Don't tell him about the money until you're absolutely certain of his character. And if he shows you who he really is, believe him. I love you, and I'm so proud of the woman you've become. Build something beautiful with this inheritance, and know that I'm watching over you always. Love, Dad." I sat in Robert's office for a long time after reading that letter, crying silently while he pretended to review documents to give me privacy. My father had known he was dying. He had known that his time was limited, and instead of spending his final months enjoying life, he had spent them protecting me from a man I should never have married. The weight of that sacrifice, that love, was almost too much to bear. But it also gave me clarity. My father had done his part. Now it was time for me to do mine. I looked up at Robert and said, "I'm ready. Let's make sure James never sees a penny of this." Robert nodded approvingly. "What do you want to tell him?" I thought about it for a moment, then said, "Tell him I inherited $50,000 and the house. Let him think that's everything. Let him show me who he really is." James was waiting in the car when I came out of the lawyer's office. He looked up from his phone eagerly, his expression a mixture of curiosity and barely concealed greed. "So, how'd it go?" I got into the passenger seat, deliberately keeping my face neutral, maybe a little sad. Dad left me $50,000 and his house. I watched James's face carefully, and what I saw there told me everything I needed to know. Disappointment. Visible, crushing disappointment. Not sympathy for my grief, not concern for my well-being, but disappointment that the payout wasn't bigger. He tried to recover quickly, rearranging his features into an expression of concern. "That's it? After everything you did for him?" Notice the phrasing. Not after everything he did for you. Not at least he left you something, but after everything you did for him, as if my relationship with my father had been a job, an investment that should have yielded better returns. I continued with my performance. He donated most of his money to charity. The lawyer said Dad wanted to leave a legacy of helping others. This was a complete fabrication, but I needed to see how James would react to the idea that the money he had been counting on was gone forever. His jaw tightened. I could see him fighting to control his anger, to maintain the facade of the supportive husband. "That's very generous of him," he said, though the words came out strangled. "So what's the house worth?" And there it was. Within 30 seconds of learning about my father's death benefits, James was already calculating assets, determining value, figuring out how much money he could extract from my grief. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe 300 for 100,000? The lawyer said I should get it appraised." James nodded slowly, and I could practically see the wheels turning in his head. Not as much as he had hoped for, but still a decent amount. Still worth the effort of maintaining the marriage for a few more months. That night, I pretended to be asleep while James made a phone call from our bathroom. He kept his voice low, but I could hear every word through the thin door. "The bastard screwed us. Gave it all to charity. Maya only got 50,000 and a house. Vanessa's voice on the other end was sharp with anger. Are you kidding me? We planned for 2 years. I know, James hissed. But the house might be worth something. I'm thinking we wait until she sells it, then file for divorce and take half. This is taking too long, Vanessa complained. Just divorce her now and cut your losses. Not yet, James said. If the house is worth 400,000, that's 200,000 for each of us. That's still worth waiting for. Besides, I've already invested 5 years in this. I'm not walking away with nothing. There was a pause. Then Vanessa said, Fine, but I'm tired of waiting, James. Make it happen soon or I'm moving on. I will, James promised. Trust me, this time next year, we'll be on a beach somewhere spending Maya's money. I lay in bed listening to my husband discuss my financial destruction like it was a business transaction, and something inside me crystallized into cold, hard determination. James thought I was naive, trusting, easy to manipulate. He thought he was the smart one, the strategic one, the one in control. He had no idea that his victim had become his predator, that every move he made was being documented, recorded, and cataloged for the moment when I would destroy him completely. My father had taught me to be patient, to be strategic, to wait for the perfect moment to act. That moment was coming, but not yet. First, I needed to test James. I needed to give him opportunities to show me if there was any decency left in him, any spark of the man I had once loved. I needed to be absolutely certain that what I was about to do was justified. So I designed a series of tests, each one carefully crafted to reveal his true character. The first test came 2 weeks after my father's funeral. I told James that the school where I taught was cutting my salary by 20% due to budget constraints. This was a lie, my salary was unchanged, but I wanted to see how he would react to the idea of our household income decreasing. A good husband would have been concerned, would have offered to cut his own spending, would have suggested we work together to adjust our budget. James did none of those things. Instead, he exploded. Are you serious? How are we supposed to survive on even less money? Not we'll figure it out together. Not I'll pick up the slack. But anger that I wasn't bringing in enough income. That week, despite knowing we were supposedly struggling financially, James bought an $800 suit. When I asked him about it, he said it was necessary for a client meeting. But I knew the truth. James wasn't concerned about our financial struggles because he didn't believe they were real. He thought I was hiding money from the inheritance, and he was spending freely because he believed that eventually he would have access to everything. The second test was more elaborate. I had Robert Chun arrange for a buyer to make an offer on my father's house. The offer was for $400,000, exactly what I had estimated the house was worth. I told James about the offer and said I was considering accepting it. His reaction was illuminating. Suddenly, the man who had been pressuring me to sell became sentimental. Babe, let's not rush into this. That house has so much sentimental value. Your father built it, you grew up there. Maybe we should hold on to it for a while, really think about whether selling is the right decision. This newfound sentimentality had nothing to do with honoring my father's memory and everything to do with James's calculation that if we sold the house while we were still married, he could claim half the proceeds in a divorce. But if I sold it after we separated, the money would be entirely mine. James wasn't being sentimental. He was being strategic. I told him I would think about it, and I watched as relief flooded his face. He thought he was manipulating me, guiding me toward the decision that would benefit him most. He had no idea I was manipulating him, gathering evidence of his true motives. The third test was the cruelest but also the most revealing. I bought a pregnancy test and left the box in our bathroom trash can where James would find it. Then I casually mentioned to him that I had been feeling nauseous lately, that I thought I might be pregnant. The look on James's face was pure horror. Not concern, not excitement, not even neutral surprise. Horror. Are you sure? He asked, his voice tight. Did you take a test? Not yet, I said, watching him carefully. I wanted to talk to you first. How would you feel if I was pregnant? James struggled to find words, his face going pale. I mean, it's not great timing. We can't really afford a kid right now, with your salary cut and everything. But if I am pregnant, I pressed, would you be happy? He couldn't even fake enthusiasm. Maya, let's just wait and see what the test says. Okay? No point getting ahead of ourselves. That night, I listened to him call Vanessa again. She thinks she might be pregnant. This complicates everything. Vanessa's response was immediate and cold. Get her to terminate it. Tell her you're not ready to be a father, that it's too expensive, whatever you have to say. We can't have a kid tying you to her for 18 years. James agreed. I'll handle it. But if she is pregnant, this is going to push back our timeline. I never told James that I wasn't actually pregnant, that it had been a test. I just let the subject drop, and he was so relieved he never brought it up again. But that test taught me something crucial. James didn't just not love me. He actively resented me. I was an obstacle to him, a problem to be solved, a barrier between him and the life he wanted with Vanessa. There was nothing left of our marriage to save, if there ever had been anything real to begin with. My father had been right all along, and I had wasted 5 years of my life on a man who saw me as a transaction. That realization was painful, but it was also liberating. Because once you accept that someone doesn't love you, you stop making excuses for them. You stop hoping they'll change. And you start planning their destruction. The next phase of my plan required help, so I hired a private investigator named Sarah Mitchell. Sarah was a former police detective who now ran her own investigation firm, and she was recommended by Robert Chin. I told her everything, showed her all the evidence my father had gathered, and asked her to dig deeper. What Sarah found exceeded my worst expectations. Vanessa wasn't just James's partner in trying to defraud me. She was a career criminal with a documented history of targeting wealthy men. Sarah uncovered 2 previous cases where Vanessa had dated men with family money, convinced them to make large financial transfers or loans, and then disappeared when the relationships ended. One of the men had tried to press charges, but Vanessa had covered her tracks well enough that prosecutors couldn't build a case. The other man had been too embarrassed to report her, choosing to write off the loss rather than admit he'd been conned. But Sarah found something else too, something I hadn't been looking for. James had been embezzling money from his employer for over 2 years. He worked for a mid-sized technology company in sales, and he had been manipulating expense reports, creating fake client accounts, and pocketing commission money that should have gone to other employees. The total amount was around $30,000, which wasn't enough to trigger an immediate audit, but was definitely enough to put him in prison if his company found out. Sarah documented everything, created a comprehensive file with bank statements, forged receipts, fake invoices, all of it. This is serious fraud, she told me. If you report this to his company, they'll press charges immediately. He's looking at 5 to 7 years in prison. I took the file and thanked her, but I wasn't ready to use that information yet. That was my nuclear option, the weapon I would deploy only if James tried to fight the divorce or make claims on assets he had no right to. There was one more piece of the puzzle I needed to put in place, and it required some creative legal maneuvering. 3 months after my father's death, I told James that the life insurance company needed him to sign some paperwork related to a policy my father had maintained. This was partially true, there was paperwork, but what James didn't know was that embedded in those documents was a postnuptial agreement. The agreement was carefully worded to sound like standard insurance documentation, full of legal jargon and formatted to match legitimate insurance forms. But buried in Section 7, Paragraph C, was a clause that stated, "The undersigned party hereby waives any and all claims, present or future, to inheritance assets, trust distributions, or estate proceeds belonging to the primary beneficiary." James signed it without reading a word. I watched him scrawl his signature across 4 different pages, never once asking what he was signing, never once slowing down to read the fine print. He was too confident, too certain that he was the one in control of our relationship. That signature would be his downfall. By the time James's birthday came around 6 months after my father's death, I had built an impenetrable legal and financial fortress around myself. All of my inheritance was secured in trusts James couldn't touch. I had documented evidence of his affair with Vanessa, his plans to defraud me, and his embezzlement from his employer. I had recorded conversations, text messages, photographs, financial records, everything I would need to destroy him completely. And I had the postnuptial agreement he had signed, unknowingly waiving all rights to any of my assets. I was ready. The only question left was timing. When would I spring the trap? I decided to wait for James to make the first move. I wanted him to be the one to ask for the divorce, to reveal his hand completely. I didn't have to wait long. 2 weeks after James's birthday, he came home from work with a strange expression on his face. We sat down for dinner, and he said, "Maya, we need to talk." I could feel my heart racing, but I kept my face calm. "Okay, what's going on?" James took a deep breath, like he was preparing to say something difficult, and then delivered the speech I'm sure he had been rehearsing for weeks. "I think we should separate. I'm not happy, and I haven't been for a while. We've grown apart. We want different things. I think it's time we both admitted this marriage isn't working." I looked at him across the table, this man I had once loved, this man who had spent 5 years pretending to be someone he wasn't, and I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. He had finally revealed himself completely. "I see," I said quietly. "Is there someone else?" James had the decency to look uncomfortable. "No, it's not like that. I just think we're better off as friends." Lies. All lies. But I played along. "If that's how you feel, I won't fight you. Maybe you're right. Maybe we do want different things." The relief on James's face was almost comical. He had expected me to cry, to beg, to try to save the marriage. Instead, I was agreeing with him, making this easy. He probably thought he was the luckiest man alive. "I'm glad you understand," he said. "We can work out the details, divide everything fairly." "Actually," I said, standing up from the table, "before we talk about dividing anything, there's something you should know." I walked to my office and returned with a folder, the same folder Sarah had prepared for me, containing every piece of evidence we had gathered. I placed it on the table in front of James. "What's this?" he asked. "Open it," I said. James opened the folder, and I watched his face as he processed what he was seeing. Bank statements showing my full inheritance. $8 million. Photographs of him with Vanessa. Transcripts of recorded phone calls where he discussed plans to defraud me. Evidence of his embezzlement from his employer. The postnuptial agreement he had signed. His face went from confusion to shock to anger to fear in the span of about 30 seconds. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "You've been spying on me?" "No, James," I said calmly. "I've been protecting myself. There's a difference. This is an invasion of privacy. You can't." "I can," I interrupted. "And I have. You see, James, while you were planning to steal my inheritance and run off with your girlfriend, I was building a case against you. Every conversation you thought was private was recorded. Every plan you made was documented. Every crime you committed was cataloged." James's hands were shaking as he flipped through the pages. "The money," he said. "You said there was only 50,000. "I lied," I said simply. "My father left me $8 million. And you're never going to see a penny of it." "That's my money too," James shouted, standing up. "We're married. I have a right to half of everything." "Actually, no," I said. "You don't. My inheritance is separate property, acquired from assets earned before our marriage. And even if it wasn't, you signed this." I pulled out a highlighted copy of the postnuptial agreement. "Remember that insurance paperwork you signed 3 months ago? You waived all rights to any inheritance I received. You signed away your claim to my father's money." James's face went white. "You tricked me." "No," I said. "You were too arrogant to read what you were signing. There's a difference." He sat back down heavily, staring at the documents spread across the table. I could see him trying to find a way out, trying to think of some angle he hadn't considered. "Vanessa," he said finally. "Vanessa will testify that you're lying, that you manipulated all of this." I smiled. "Actually, Vanessa won't be testifying to anything. I offered her $50,000 to flip on you, and she took it without hesitation. Turns out loyalty doesn't mean much to con artists." James looked like he had been punched in the stomach. "You're lying." "I'm not," I said. "In fact, Vanessa provided even more evidence against you." She gave us copies of text messages, recorded some of your phone calls herself, even wrote out a detailed statement describing your entire plan. For $50,000, she was happy to throw you under the bus. The truth was even worse than I had implied. Vanessa hadn't just taken my money and disappeared. She had given us information about 2 other men James had been grooming, other potential marks with wealthy family members. James wasn't just a one-time con artist. He was a serial predator, and I was simply his most lucrative target. Here's what's going to happen, I said, my voice steady and cold. You're going to move out of this house tonight. We're getting divorced and you're getting nothing. 0. Not a penny, not a stick of furniture, nothing. You'll sign the divorce papers without contesting, or I'll send this evidence of your embezzlement to your employer and the police. You can't do this, James said, but his voice lacked conviction. He knew he was beaten. I can, I said, and I am. You have 24 hours to move out. After that, I'm changing the locks and filing a restraining order. And if you even think about trying to fight me on this, remember that I have enough evidence to put you in prison for 5 to 7 years. James tried one more desperate play. I loved you, he said. At the beginning, I really did love you. I looked at him, this pathetic man who had wasted 5 years of my life, and I felt nothing but contempt. No, James, you never loved me. You loved the idea of my father's money. You loved what you thought I could give you, but you never knew me at all. And now you never will. He left that night with 2 suitcases and the clothes on his back. Everything else, the furniture, the dishes, the television, all of it had been purchased with money from my teaching salary, and he had no claim to any of it. I watched him load his car from the window, and when he drove away, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. The divorce was finalized within 3 months. James signed every paper without contest because he knew that fighting me would only result in criminal charges. His lawyer tried to negotiate for something, anything, but when I showed him the evidence file and the signed postnuptial agreement, even the lawyer advised James to walk away. You have no case, his attorney told him. Take the loss and move on. James got exactly what he deserved, which was nothing. The day the divorce was finalized, I opened a bottle of champagne my father had been saving for a special occasion and toasted to his memory. He had protected me even from beyond the grave, and I was determined to honor that protection by building something meaningful with the inheritance he had left me. But I wasn't quite finished with James yet. There was still the matter of his embezzlement, and I had made myself a promise that if James tried to cause any trouble after the divorce, I would ensure he faced consequences for all of his crimes, not just the ones against me. True to form, James couldn't let things go. 2 weeks after the divorce was final, he began spreading rumors about me. He told mutual friends that I had hidden money from him, that I had manipulated him, that I was a cold, calculating woman who had destroyed his life out of spite. The stories got back to me through people who knew the truth, and I realized that James was trying to salvage his reputation by destroying mine. That was his final mistake. I contacted James's employer with the evidence Sarah had compiled about his embezzlement. I provided them with bank statements, forged expense reports, fake client accounts, everything they needed to conduct a thorough audit. The company was shocked. They had trusted James, promoted him, given him opportunities, and he had been stealing from them for years. They fired him immediately and pressed criminal charges. James was arrested within a week, charged with fraud, embezzlement, and theft. The trial was quick because the evidence was overwhelming. James couldn't afford a good lawyer since Vanessa had disappeared with what little money he had managed to save, and his public defender advised him to take a plea deal. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months. The judge was surprisingly harsh in his sentencing remarks. You betrayed everyone who trusted you, she said. Your wife, your employer, your colleagues. You showed a pattern of deception and manipulation that demonstrates a fundamental lack of character. This sentence reflects not just the crime you committed against your company, but the broader pattern of fraud that defined your life. I didn't attend the trial. I didn't need to. I had already moved on to building the life my father had envisioned for me. I started by establishing the Maya Chun Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to financial literacy and helping women recognize the signs of financial abuse in relationships. The foundation offered free counseling, legal assistance, and education programs for women who found themselves in situations similar to mine. We taught them how to protect their assets, how to recognize manipulation, and how to build independent financial security. Within the first year, we helped over 1,000 women escape financially abusive relationships and regain control of their lives. The work was deeply satisfying, and I knew my father would have been proud. I also took over management of my father's real estate portfolio. The properties ranged from small residential homes to large commercial buildings, and they generated substantial monthly income. I spent months learning every aspect of the business, studying market trends, understanding property management, and building relationships with tenants and other investors. My father had taught me well during our weekly dinners, even if I hadn't realized at the time that he was preparing me to take over his empire. Within 2 years, I had grown the portfolio's value from $4 million to $7 million through strategic acquisitions and improvements. I discovered that I had a talent for real estate, an eye for undervalued properties, and an instinct for profitable investments. The work gave me purpose and helped me heal from the betrayal of my marriage. But the real transformation wasn't financial. It was personal. For 5 years, I had been Maya Martinez, a woman who defined herself by her marriage, who made herself smaller to accommodate her husband's ego, who ignored her own instincts to maintain peace. That woman was gone. In her place was Maya Chan, a woman who trusted her judgment, who refused to be manipulated, who built her own empire on her own terms. I cut my hair short, started dressing in a way that made me feel powerful rather than pretty, and stopped apologizing for taking up space. I made new friends, people who knew me as the successful businesswoman I had become rather than the naive wife I had been. I traveled to places James had never wanted to go, ate at restaurants he had deemed too expensive, and spent money on experiences rather than impressing people who didn't matter. I learned to be alone without being lonely, to enjoy my own company, to build a life that belonged entirely to me. 3 years after my divorce, I met Daniel at a real estate conference. He was a property developer with his own successful company, and we struck up a conversation about market trends that turned into a 3-hour dinner. Daniel was everything James had never been. Honest, straightforward, genuinely interested in me as a person rather than as a meal ticket. When he asked me out, I almost said no out of habit, out of fear that I would make the same mistake twice. But then I remembered something my father had told me once. Not everyone is a predator, Maya. Some people are just good people. Don't let one bad experience make you afraid to trust again. So I said yes, and Daniel and I began dating slowly, carefully, with both of us being honest about our pasts and our expectations. 6 months into our relationship, I did something that surprised even me. I asked Daniel to sign a prenuptial agreement. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I had learned that love and legal protection weren't mutually exclusive. I need you to understand, I told him over dinner one night. I have significant assets and I need to protect them. Not from you specifically, but as a general principle. If you're uncomfortable with that, I understand, but it's non-negotiable for me. Daniel didn't hesitate. I completely understand, he said. And honestly, I respect you more for asking. You're protecting yourself and the legacy your father left you. I would never want you to feel vulnerable in our relationship. We hired separate attorneys and drew up a fair prenuptial agreement that protected both of our assets while still allowing us to build a life together. It was the healthiest relationship decision I had ever made. Daniel and I got married 2 years later in a small ceremony with close friends and family. It was nothing like my first wedding, which had been a large, expensive affair designed more to impress people than to celebrate love. This wedding was intimate, meaningful, and entirely about the commitment we were making to each other. We wrote our own vows, and when Daniel promised to honor your independence, respect your judgment, and build a partnership based on trust, I cried because those were the things I had always wanted but never had with James. Our marriage was different from the beginning. We maintained separate bank accounts while also having a joint account for household expenses. We made major financial decisions together but respected each other's autonomy for personal spending. We communicated openly about money, goals, and expectations. And most importantly, we trusted each other because that trust had been earned through consistent honesty and respect. 5 years after my father's death, I was running a $30 million real estate empire. The properties my father had left me had been leveraged into a much larger portfolio through smart acquisitions and strategic partnerships. I had also expanded into property development, working with Daniel's company to build affordable housing units in underserved communities. The work was profitable but also meaningful, providing quality homes for families who had been priced out of the market by gentrification and speculation. The foundation I had started in my father's memory was now helping over 10,000 women annually, with satellite offices in 5 different states. We had expanded our services to include job training, childcare assistance, and emergency housing for women escaping abusive relationships. The foundation's work had been featured in national publications, and I had been invited to speak at conferences about financial abuse and women's economic empowerment. My personal life was equally fulfilling. Daniel and I had a daughter, and we named her Marcus after my father. She was 3 years old now, smart and curious and stubborn in the best possible way. Watching her grow up in a household where respect and honesty were the foundation of her parents' relationship gave me hope that she would never accept the kind of treatment I had endured from James. We were teaching her from an early age to be financially literate, to understand the value of money, and to never depend entirely on another person for her security. She would grow up knowing her worth, and that knowledge would protect her in ways I wished I had been protected. I thought about James occasionally, wondering what had become of him after his release from prison. I knew from mutual acquaintances that he had served 2 years of his 3-year sentence and had been released early for good behavior. He had moved to a different state, was working some minimum wage job, and was living alone in a small apartment. His reputation in our city had been destroyed by the embezzlement trial, and he had no choice but to start over somewhere else where people didn't know his history. I felt no satisfaction in his downfall, but I felt no pity either. James had made his choices, and now he was living with the consequences. That was justice, plain and simple. Then, 5 years to the day after my father's funeral, something happened that brought everything full circle. I was at the gas station filling up my Mercedes when I looked up and saw a familiar face across the parking lot. James was standing by an old, beaten-up Honda, pumping gas and looking tired, older than his years. Our eyes met, and for a moment, neither of us moved. Then James walked toward me, and I felt my heart rate increase, though I wasn't afraid. I was simply curious about what he would say after all these years. "Maya," he said, stopping a few feet away from me. "It's been a long time." "Yes, it has," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. We stood there in awkward silence for a moment, and then James said, "I heard you did well for yourself. The real estate business, the foundation, all of it. I'm glad." I didn't respond because I knew he wasn't glad at all. He was resentful, bitter about the life I had built while his had fallen apart. "Was it worth it?" he asked finally. "Destroying me?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a broken man who had never learned the lesson he needed to learn. "I didn't destroy you, James. You destroyed yourself. I just refused to be your victim." "I loved you," he said, and I could hear the desperation in his voice, the need to believe that some part of what we had was real. "No," I said firmly. "You loved my father's money. You loved what you thought I could give you. But you never knew me, and you certainly never loved me." James's face crumpled. If I had actually loved you, actually been a decent husband, I could have had everything. The money, the life, all of it. I threw it all away because I was greedy. "Yes," I said simply. "You did. Do you ever think about what we could have been?" he asked. "If things had been different?" I thought about the question for a moment, then shook my head. "No, James. I don't think about alternate timelines or what-ifs. I think about what actually happened. You tried to use me, to steal from me, to discard me once you had taken everything you could. That's who you were, probably still are. And I'm grateful that I discovered the truth before it was too late." "I'm sorry," James said, and for the first time he sounded genuine. "For whatever that's worth, I'm sorry for what I did to you." Your apology doesn't change anything, I said. But I hope you've learned something from all this. I hope you've learned that people aren't transactions, that relationships aren't investment opportunities, and that greed will always lead to destruction. James nodded, looking down at the ground. I have learned that, but it's too late for me now. I lost everything. You lost everything you tried to steal, I corrected. That's different. I finished filling my tank and prepared to leave, but James called out one more time. Are you happy? He asked. Is the money worth it? I thought about my daughter, my husband, the foundation, the lives I had changed, the empire I had built. The money isn't what makes me happy, I said. It's the freedom to build a life on my own terms, to help others, to create something meaningful. That's what my father's inheritance gave me. Not money, but possibility. You were only ever interested in the money, James. That's why you'll never understand. I drove away from that gas station and never looked back. James had been a chapter in my life, a painful one, but he was part of a story that had ended years ago. The woman I had become was so far removed from the naive teacher who had trusted the wrong man that they barely seemed like the same person. My father had given me more than an inheritance. He had given me the tools to protect myself, the wisdom to recognize danger, and the courage to build something beautiful from betrayal. His final act of love had been to ensure that I would never be anyone's victim, and I had honored that gift by becoming a woman he would have been proud of. That evening, I went to my father's grave for the first time in years. I placed fresh flowers on the headstone and sat down on the grass beside it. Hey, Dad, I said quietly. I hope you can see what I've built. I hope you know that your sacrifice wasn't in vain. You were right about James. You were right about everything. I should have listened to you from the beginning, but I guess I needed to learn the hard way. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cemetery, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me. My father had protected me, even knowing he wouldn't be there to see the outcome. He had given me everything I needed to survive and thrive, and I had taken that gift and multiplied it into something that would help thousands of other women avoid the same trap I had almost fallen into. I met Daniel, I continued, talking to the headstone as if my father could hear me. He's nothing like James. He's honest and kind, and he loves Marcus, our daughter, your granddaughter. I wish you could have met her. She has your eyes and your stubborn streak. She's going to be something special, Dad. And she's going to grow up knowing that she should never settle for less than she deserves, that she should trust her instincts, and that love should never cost her independence. I stood up and brushed the grass from my pants. Thank you for everything. Thank you for the inheritance, yes, but more than that, thank you for teaching me to be strong, to be smart, and to never let anyone make me feel small. I'm living the life you wanted for me, and I'm going to make sure your legacy continues through the foundation and through Marcus. You'll never be forgotten. As I walked back to my car, I thought about the journey I had been on. From the terrified woman falling through the sky of her marriage to the confident businesswoman I had become, the transformation had been complete. James had tried to take everything from me, but instead, he had inadvertently given me something valuable. He had taught me what I would never tolerate again. He had shown me the importance of protecting myself. And he had proven that my father's instincts had been right all along. Some people are predators, and the only way to survive them is to be smarter, stronger, and more strategic than they are. The title of this story asks what happened next after I hid my inheritance from my husband. What happened next was that I saved myself. I built an empire. I helped thousands of women. I found real love. I raised a daughter who would never be anyone's victim. And I honored my father's memory by becoming the woman he always knew I could be. James thought my silence was weakness, that my trust was naivety, that my love was exploitable. He learned too late that my silence was strategy, my trust was conditional, and my love had limits. The day I inherited $8 million and told my husband nothing wasn't the day I became rich. It was the day I became free. And that freedom was worth more than any amount of money could ever be.